Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise, and welcome to this think-in on the unbelievably important question, what are the economics of greening energy? How important? Let me very briefly indulge myself with a story. I was lucky enough and carbon intensive enough to spend a bit of time in the past month on the east coast of the US, where the weather was unusually overcast, and everybody blamed it on smoke drifting in from the west. And then last week, I was on the west coast and flying over Canada. Skies are clear. You get to the US, the whole sky is full of smoke. These obviously attribution is an inexact science, but the fires burning across the American West are blamed on climate change. I don't think anybody really needs persuading now of the urgency of the problem. And of course, economics are central to the solution. The question, what are the economics of greening energy, can be taken as a very specific question. In other words, what's in the in tray of a CFO or a chief economist of a business, especially a carbon intensive business. But it can also be taken more generally. You know, how the heck do we ensure that business, and in particular, big carbon intensive business, is a part of the solution when it comes to the energy transition rather than a part of the problem? There's a lot of optimism out there. I mean, there's obviously pessimism as well, but I'm just going to read something from my phone because my new high-tech way of getting this stuff is by screenshotting my laptop. This is from the Tony Blair Institute for Change. Recently on the subject that we're all engaged with, namely how to make the energy transition a reality. Paragraph 4, unleashing the power of the private sector and the state. I won't read the whole thing, but it says the development of coronavirus vaccines has shown that when private sector innovation and ingenuity is supported and enabled by government action, positive change can happen at previously unimaginable speed by supercharging the integration of net zero technologies into our economies and strengthening international collaboration. And then he goes on to talk about COP26. I was interested in that paragraph because the word supercharging is doing a lot of work. How do we integrate these technologies into the energy transition? That's the kind of thing that I'd love to talk about today. So this is one of a series of think-ins that we are hosting in partnership with BP on the energy transition between now and COP and after COP. And as I say, there'll be opportunities over the course of that series and other think-ins that we're doing related to net zero to get into the weeds of the investment case and to get much more specific and granular about the economics. And nothing's off limits today, but I would like, if possible today, to touch on questions like what the transition is going to cost. Estimates sort of vary widely, but in the tens, hundreds of trillions. How can it be funded? What does government need from business and vice versa? And what in particular is the experience of businesses working with this government in this country? We've got a wealth of expertise among our invited guests, who I'll introduce in just a second. First, just to say, for anybody who's new to a Think-In, the object is to hear from you. So we'll obviously hear from our guests, but please pitch in, not just wait till the end of the hour. Right away, if there's anything that you'd like to interject on. We have a loosely enforced no questions rule. That doesn't mean you can't ask a question. It just means we want to hear what you know, what you feel, what you think, because we find that audiences are formidably well-informed and engaged, as well as our invited speakers. So use the electronic hand, which you can find under reactions at the bottom of your screen, or please pitch in the chat. My colleague Barney is the genius behind the slides, by the way, and also is monitoring the chat. We are joined today by Will Zimmern, who is head of energy transition and systems analysis at BP. It's kind of no pressure. I cannot believe the pressure of and the importance of the kind of role that you're in. But I'm sure we'll hear a bit more about that. Martijn Rats, chief global oil strategist and head of European energy research at Morgan Stanley. Jade Pallister, who's an advisor to the Labour Party and also an account manager at PLMR's energy and sustainability practice, which is, I guess, the cold face of greening, or at least advising on greening. And Professor Robert Gross from, I was going to say the UK Energy Research Council, but you just said UKIRK, so I'll say UKIRK. That's what it is. And also from Imperial, but now based at UCL, who's Robert's been an advisor to the House of Lords, Climate Change Committee, and many other august bodies. And Robert, if I may, I'd like to start with you. Really to ask, are we framing this right? Is it a given that the giants of the carbon-based economy have to be a part of this transition that we all want to make a success of? And if so, and feel free to wing it, how can you summarize the kind of support that they can expect and need in being a part of that transition?
Thanks, Giles. So I think the first thing that I would say, the primary conceptualization that I have of the challenge of decarbonisation is that it's an infrastructure challenge. So the reason that it's going to cost, however many tens or hundreds of trillions as around the world is because we have to reinvent the entirety of the kind of socio-technical system that delivers our energy service needs in an unprecedentedly short period of time. So energy infrastructures have always changed, right? I mean, we burn wood, then we burn coal, then we move to oil and gas. Nuclear comes in and does a bit, then we do a bit more with gas. But usually that's a multi-decadal change that's driven by a combination of regulation and commercial opportunity and new technology and very, very complex relationship with the wider economy. And what we want to try to do to get to 2 degrees or 1.5 or net zero is to accelerate a transition away from the fossil fuels that are very convenient and relatively easy and cheap to move around towards other sources of energy. And in doing that, what we're doing is we're moving away from an infrastructure that, although it seems very capital intensive, because there's lots of big bits of kit like power stations and power lines and oil refineries, it's actually in economic terms relatively capital light compared to some of the things that we're going to need to use instead, like nuclear power stations and offshore wind and all of those kinds of things. And it turns the economics around, right? Because the fuel is free, in inverted commas. It's not really, because you have to invest in an expensive bit of kit to get at that resource. And so that means that you're moving to a more capital intensive energy system. in terms of the costs of a unit of energy from a gas-fired power station. About half of that might be the cost of the gas. The other half might be the cost of the finance on the power station. For an offshore wind farm, it's all almost the finance of the offshore wind farm.
Can I just interrupt?
Of course, yeah.
To make sure that I understand what you mean about the existing system being capital light, is that because the cost of building the infrastructure is already sunk, as it were? As the money's already been spent? Partly.
It's also because you're tapping a very kind of energy intense resource. Right. So it's in terms of the amount of kit that's needed for a barrel of oil, it's a relatively small amount of kit compared to the amount of kit that's needed for it, to split the atom in a nuclear power station or access offshore wind. The resources are more diffuse, so the kind of relationship between the infrastructure need and the fuel availability is different. So it's more capital intensive. Ultimately, in the long run, it should deliver us cheaper energy services. And that's what you see in some of these scenarios from the IEA and from the Committee on the Climate Change Committee in the UK and others. There's a kind of build out phase where we have to do this new infrastructure. And then in the maybe 2040s, 2050s and beyond, we start to get the benefit of effectively the fuel is free. And so the challenge is well, there's many challenges, but one of the challenges is to be able to think of a way that we can finance this transition, spread that cost out, not disadvantage particularly the poorest current consumers, as already seen in the chat, for example, and in order to kind of then unlock that opportunity. And should I don't speak on behalf of the likes of BP. There's an obvious they have skills, they have capability, they have capital that they can mobilize. So it would be a shame if they weren't part of that transition, it seems to me.
Okay, thanks very much for that introduction. Will, let me come to you with a very simple question, which is, sat where you are, what do you mean by greening? Because I mean, I'm reasonably familiar with the plans that BP in particular has made over the past couple of years. But is it fair to say that you're asking, I mean, we can speak as a sector, that you're asking people to take a certain amount on trust?
I guess it is fair. I mean, just to start with, just to say, I think a greening company is not an agreed definition, but the way I think about it is a company that is greening is one that is not low carbon today, but has ambitions to be low carbon in the future. And BP is one of those companies, but there are many other companies within the energy sector and outside. I mean, Giles, I'm sure you're aware, 70% of greenhouse gas emissions come from energy consumption in industry, transport, and the energy sector. So just 3 sectors. And so there are many, many companies in those sectors which are, high carbon today, but that have the ambition to be low carbon. And BP is one of them. We see that the world needs to change. You can read a report, in BP's Energy Outlook or in IEA reports or other reports. It's very clear that we're not on track to meet the climate ambitions that we need to be. So the world needs to change. It needs to change significantly. That provides some opportunities, or many opportunities, and BP wants to be part of those opportunities. And that's how I would describe a greening company, a company that sees those opportunities, sees a future that has to be different from the future than the past, and sets credible and realistic targets to go after some of those opportunities. So I think you can't just take it on trust. You can't just say, we want to change. Actions matter. And I think setting clear targets, clear pathways, clear goals that we can then be assessed against. Because I don't think Giles, to answer your question, I don't think it automatically follows that energy companies like BP need to be part of the transition. I think we have to prove our place there. I personally believe that there are lots of skills, capabilities of a company like BP that can help the transition, but we need to prove that we can do that, and that's the journey we're on. And it's not easy, but it's not going to be easy for any company that wants to be greener than they are today, which is almost every company in the world today.
Right. You said when we were speaking on the phone a few days ago that one of the things that you spend a lot of time thinking about is energy systems, broadly defined. And one of Barney's slides showed, well, the one before the sort of IEA/UN's preferred phase out of fossil fuels was the colossal upfront investment required, and in a way, this is what Robert was referring to, in various other technologies. Give us your big picture of the kind of energy system that you hope BP and other companies like it will be a part of, not 10, but 20 years hence. How complete is the transition by then, and what's your core competence at that point?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So, I mean, absolutely agree with Rob that there needs to be a massive change and huge upfront investment. And the simple thing is, you know, where you can electrify something. And because I think that we know how to produce zero carbon electricity. It's with, you know, wind and solar backed up with some dispatchable power, but we know how to produce that. So that's something that the world needs to do. So electrify things quickly. So that's the first point. The second point is there are areas, for example, long distance transport, aviation or trucking, so in industrial sectors that require very high heat, sort of seasonal storage, where it is not easy to electrify these things because of the nature of electricity. You know, it doesn't produce high heat, or it's expensive to store, and therefore you need different types of technologies. And that's an area that some of those technologies are very close to what BP does. So there's been a lot of talk about hydrogen over the last few years. You know, hydrogen is something that it's a gas, it's an energy carrier. You move it around in pipes. You can produce it using a range of sources, you know, natural gas or renewable energy. And so this something like working with hydrogen, transporting hydrogen, producing hydrogen, selling hydrogen to customers is something that we feel at BP that we have a comparative advantage doing. I mean, there are others, you know, I think offshore wind is a great example. You know, companies, the oil and gas industry have been working offshore for many years. And so we have some core competency sort of building out offshore wind. And so that's something, you know, we're also looking at. These are sort of high technology, high investment, some of them high risk projects, which need to scale fast. And this is something that energy companies are good at, you know, capital heavy, high technology, high investment projects. And so, you know, we feel that this is a place that we can play and we can support the transition. And so, you know, so back to your original question, electrify everything you can, and then look to see how you can provide the energy for those parts of the world or the systems that you can't electrify.
Just one more question before we come to Jade. And by the way, David, I note your point in the chat, David Clayton. I might come to you in a second to ask you to expand on that. But just on hydrogen, and you make the point that BP and others have appropriate competencies. There is a big question, though, isn't there? Where's the money going to come from? Because someone has to break the logjam. My colleague Katie Vanek-Smith pointed me to the story about Joe Bamford setting up £1 billion hydrogen investment fund, and he's put 100 million of his family's own money into it. So he clearly thinks there are returns. But as I understand it, the way things stand right now, people in your position are kind of waiting for the government to make a first move and say, we've got your back, we're going to subsidize this to the extent that it's commercial.
Yeah, it's an important point. So I think, if hand on heart today, it's hard to make the business case for hydrogen next year. What we need is a price on carbon, or we need to be remunerated for using hydrogen instead of using natural gas, say. So if you're an iron and steel plant, you know, it is far cheaper just to buy natural gas and use that to manufacture your steel. To convert that plant to hydrogen and then use that to create so-called green steel is more expensive. And so you need to be paid for that. There's a number of mechanisms. You can go through sort of policy mechanisms. So, for example, a carbon price where you charge for every sort of unit of CO2 that a company emits, and if you pay that price, then you have an incentive to reduce emissions, and that's something that, you know, we believe at BP, and I strongly believe as an economist that it is required. That is, you know, at the moment the carbon price is not high enough. You know, in Europe we're seeing prices unprecedented highs at $50–60 a ton. You know, we think, you know, we need a carbon price at about $100 a ton by 2030. You know, could be over $200 a ton by 2050 to reach some of these climate goals. And so what we need from policymakers really is some certainty, saying that, you know, we are going to gradually increase the carbon price over time so that it reaches some of those levels. And that creates the incentives for private capital to invest in this decade so that we can produce at scale for the next decade. So that is something that we need. And sort of Joe Bamford's fund, you know, fantastic that private capital is moving into these areas, but policy certainty and policy commitment that these investments will pay off over the long term is something that is going to be required to inject the amount of capital that we need for this transition.
Okay, thank you. So how that pans out depends to a large extent on a big argument between business and government, which is my segue to Jade, because you advise companies, including energy companies, as I understand it, on how to talk to government, what to ask for. And if it feels like I'm asking you to betray all your professional secrets, that's exactly what I am doing. I mean, especially to the extent that you're familiar with this particular government, what do you advise an energy company to say to government when trying to frame their own net zero strategy and presumably get as much help as possible?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think we're in a really interesting point ahead of COP26. We've had numerous announcements from the government, but it's very clear that we're still in very nascent stages. So the majority of announcements are asking for, we need more help from the private sector to do this, or please submit your ideas to this new consultation that we published. And I think a lot of private companies are responding with, oh well, we've got our, you know, our own objectives that we want to push here. And it's really interesting when you think about the transition, because obviously the transition is going from A to B. So companies within that transition will play an important role. So just thinking about, you know, energy and you know, how do we heat homes, for example? You have heat pump providers saying, you know, well, heat pumps is going to be the solution. Then you have, you know, electric heating providers will say, well, we can't afford, no one can afford heat pumps. So in the middle, we need electric. So we need, you know, more funding for scaling up electric. So I think that's really interesting. And I think what companies need to think about is, well, what do the government actually care about right now? And thinking about that holistic timeline of, you know, you're not just thinking about what you can achieve now, you're thinking about what you're doing now, you're thinking about what you're going to do in the future, and having a really clear strategy. But it's also really interesting to think about what the Treasury is actually thinking, because as Will mentioned, a lot of companies want increased subsidies, they want help, they want investment from the government, they want clarity from the government that they're gonna back them if they continue to invest. And I think one of the questions that we've kind of seen, especially today, both with the national insurance tax increase, but also the Australian deal, you know, how much is the government actually going to be committed to investing in the green agenda? With, you know, the gas boiler ban, if people aren't familiar, it was suggested that they were thinking about potentially banning gas boilers, and they had a U-turn on it, saying, you know, heat pumps are inaccessible and too expensive. So I think, and today also you've had the removing climate pledges from the Australian deal, for instance. So it's the question of how much money are the Treasury actually going to put behind this, especially as we move on from COP26. It's probably going to actually be the private sector who will have to continue holding the baton. So in terms of what that means for companies in their engagement, it's thinking holistically. It's thinking, how do we frame our ask in a way the government cares about? It cares about jobs, levelling up, return on investment. can you ask it to invest £5 billion in your part of in your net zero strategy? Probably not. It's how are you going to fund this? Have you thought about everything there? So it's quite complex. But.
So broadly, do you find your clients do not say that they're not getting enough clarity from this government at the moment to do their planning?
Yes, you have a mixture. There's as I mentioned, the government are looking for a lot of advice from private companies. There's a lot of opportunity to influence. They haven't got the answers, and it's a Conservative government. They want to do this with the private sector support. But there are a lot. To take an example, I work with an aviation client, obviously a very hard to decarbonise sector, aviation. The government have invested 15 million in developing sustainable aviation fuel. So that is the fuel that is made from waste, and it can be mixed with fuel potentially as early as 2026. The problem is 50 million might sound like a lot, but actually this client in particular pays that amount in the UK ETS scheme alone in 1 year. So realistically, if each airline are contributing around 15 million each year, and the government's only committed 15 million to help scale up this sustainable aviation fuel, is that going to be enough? Is that going to help us get there quicker if we increase it? So
right. So my sense is that there's a step change needed in sort of ambition, but I don't want to prejudge that or put words into your mouth. Thanks very much. We'll come back to many of these, but let me come to Martijn Rats now, because you deal with hard numbers. Let me ask a very basic question. How much is this all going to cost, and is the money there?
Yeah, that's an excellent one. And not to make a short answer long, but maybe if you allow me a minute or so, maybe I can take a little bit of a run up to that question and indeed provide some numbers around this whole issue. So if you look at the total consumption of energy across the world, and you add up what we consume, not only in oil, gas, coal, but also in nuclear, renewables, hydro, biofuels, you add everything up and you express it in units of energy, which is hard to do because these are units that are, we normally don't really relate to in our daily life, but you'd end up with a figure of around about 600 exajoule. Now, an exa is basically, it fits in the sort of, kilo, mega, giga sort of range. We don't use exa all that often because it basically means 18 zeros. So 600 exajoule is 600, and then another 18 zeros, joules, and joule is the unit of energy. Now, 600 exajoule is globally what we consume in energy as a world. We're about 7.5 billion people or so. So per person, that is about 80 gigajoule per person per year. Now, this is an interesting number, 80 gigajoule. If you look broadly at sort of lifestyles that people enjoy in different countries around the world, there is a general perception amongst people that study the energy system that like a sort of a modern lifestyle would require something like a minimum of 100, maybe 120 gigajoule per person per year. China is at 100 gigajoule or thereabouts per person per year. Europe is at 140. The US is 280. Canada is 350. If you live in the Caribbean or the Middle East, you're looking at numbers that are far, far higher than that. But if you live in India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, you're looking at numbers that are far, far lower than that. So the consumption of energy and how it's distributed across the world is deeply, deeply uneven. So this whole setup basically creates three challenges. One, the global population is growing still quite fast. We're adding 1 billion people to the planet about every 13, 14 years or so. We've done that over the last 13, 14 years. These are also forecasts from the World Bank for the next 13, 14 years. Over the next 13, 14 years, GDP per capita will probably rise by about 40% in real terms. This is a per capita number, inflation adjusted. That sounds like a big number, and in many ways it is.
40 or 14? 40 or 14?
14, 14%. Oh, no.
No, 14
Every 13
years.
to 14 years, we're looking at a close to 40% increase in real terms GDP per capita.
Okay.
That looks like a big number, but that is actually a marked deceleration from what we've enjoyed over the last 20 years. So GDP per capita is growing but decelerating. Nevertheless, over the next 13 to 14 years, 1 billion more people, plus the GDP per capita goes up by close to 40%. And then we're left with the very uneven nature of energy distribution. It's hard to say to people that consume these very low levels of energy that they can't sort of at least go to the average, or can't get, that they shouldn't aspire to get to that level of 100 gigajoules per person per year. At the moment, 5.5 billion people around the world consume less than 100 gigajoules per year. And so those three factors, population growth, rising GDP per capita, and a sort of catch up from the developing world, put tremendous upward pressure on our total energy consumption. And total energy consumption doesn't really only scale with GDP per capita, which looks like a sort of a financial number and it's all about money. The United Nations has an index, which is called the Human Development Index. And it has GDP per capita in there, but it also has life expectancy at birth, the number of years of education that you can expect, I believe some equality measures as well. It's sort of a broad measure of, human advancement. That index, the Human Development Index of the UN, scales incredibly strongly with energy consumption. And in an exponential manner. If you want to go beyond a certain index level, basically beyond the level of China, really you have accelerating energy demands to eke out incremental score on the Human Development Index. So the challenge that we really have is that we need to decarbonize whilst the whole system has this upward pressure in terms of overall growth. I think ultimately, we have to be very optimistic where we can get in the end. There's fascinating work done by a research group at Stanford University under the leadership of Professor Mark Jacobson. If you look at peer-reviewed research that he publishes on how we can design a world that is entirely driven by wind, water, and solar, hard to argue that is not possible. But the pace at which we can turn over our energy infrastructure is slow. And there is a practical reality that simply producing more green electricity, however cheap it is, doesn't lower the requirement for gasoline and diesel today. It takes time to change the system. If you look at how we consume our energy, you can broadly split it. 80% of our final energy consumption is an oil, gas, or coal molecule. 20% is electricity. But in that 20%, about 18 points of that come from hydro, nuclear, or biomass. And these are hard to scale. Scaling nuclear quickly, difficult. Scaling biomass, very difficult. You compete with food for arable land. 2/3 of the rivers in the world already have a dam in it, or at least 2/3 of the rivers that are suitable for that. So the renewables that we're enthusiastic about, wind and solar effectively, they form about sort of 2 to 3% of our final energy consumption. So the challenge that we really have is that the system is growing. We have 80% that comes effectively from fossil fuels. That needs to come down. And the part that we can scale effectively, green renewables like wind and solar are just 2 to 3% of our energy mix, and that we need to increase. Now you can see that the sort of imbalance in the system is not easily resolved. Now, to answer your question, I'm sorry to have taken such a long sort of run up, but herein lies the challenge to do all of this, right? To get on track and to do all of this. The IEA recently calculated in their net zero report that they published in May that total energy investment need to go from about sort of 2 trillion a year to about 5 trillion a year, an incremental 3 trillion every year for the next 30 years. And they're from that's the source of these sort of very large estimates of investment. Now, look, the practical reality is that there is quite a lot of interest to finance this. I mean, investors are in principle positively disposed to this entire decarbonization team. So that is still there. But in the fullness of time, this money will not be forthcoming if the returns on that capital are simply unattractive. And at the moment, the jury is out. And therein lies the role for governments. We need two things from government. We need somewhat invasive government policies where the government basically can say, you can do this, but you cannot do that. simply saying, oh, the carbon price is $100 a ton and we can do some, financial work around that, I suspect will not slow demand enough. But we also need governments to effectively put in place the regulations and the systems and the structures that make investing in wind, solar, hydrogen, EV charging stations, all this new infrastructure, to make that work. Now, at the moment, I would say we're probably not quite there, but it's a journey, and we should be able to get there. But that is really what we need.
Okay, so Martin, you said an awful lot to do. Change, if experience is any guide, comes too slowly. The money's there, the interest is there, but the jury is out on returns. So where the optimism that you mentioned, halfway through that?
I think the optimism has to come from what is technologically possible. In principle, from the standpoint of pure physics, there is more than enough sunlight hitting the Earth so that we can either capture it directly through solar panels and generate electricity, or that same solar energy creates differences in air pressure, causes winds to blow, and we can capture that energy. There, in principle, there is enough. The problem with a lot of renewable energy is that the energy density is so low, right?
Yeah.
And then we need to capture this electricity in the battery. Well, the best battery technology that we have at the moment is still, lithium-based batteries. The energy density of a liter of gasoline is 60 times that of the best lithium battery. And, cost scale with weight, and weight scales with density. And so a lot of the fossil fuels in terms of energy density have this sort of huge convenience and cost advantage still in many areas, not everywhere, but still in many areas. So there's a lot to overcome, but in principle, we should be optimistic about what can be achieved purely from a technology point of view. We just need to do it, and it's a big system to overhaul.
Yes, Will, I see your hand up, but and I'll come to you in a second. But I did promise I wanted to come to David, because David Clayton made a couple of points in the chat, actually, I've now scrolled down to you talking about really big global levers. What are they, and what could they do, David?
Hey, Giles. So look, I think that one of the things that's most disappointing about what's going on in the run-up to COP is that what I think a year ago people thought would be a big push towards sort of regulatory coherence and a confluence of blocks all pointing in the same direction. And by that I mean particularly central banks and regulators. That doesn't seem to be happening from where I'm sitting. The EU's got its thing.
Where are you sitting, by the way? You've got a space rocket in the background.
I do, yes. It's a Lego space rocket. Look at that. There it is. The EU's got its SFRDs and SFDRs and CSRDs. TCFD is one big narrative for central banks. The Chinese are doing something else. The SEC wants to do something else. So the first thing I would say is that the financial coherence around frameworks to support investment into renewables are not becoming more coherent. That's the first point. Second point is, I think that the taxonomy that describes what is green, what is not, those things are not becoming more coherent. They're becoming more distinct and more fragmented. The third thing is that the way in which that data wants to get used by central banks to try and incentivize greening investment, that doesn't seem to be becoming more coherent. So when I say big levers, Giles, I mean that, for this to work really effectively and coherently, what you needed to see out of the G20 finance ministers meeting in Venice was not Janet Yellen coming out and sort of mumbling about the idea that at some point we need to all think about whether or not we could at some point, somewhere, at some time, have a framework that hangs together. You needed to say something really strong. So that's not happening. So that's one of my really, really big concerns, Giles. And then I just, outside of that, I do think that the distributional issues, like in Fit for 55 in Europe, you have real change, real policy that's going to have real distributional consequences. Timmermans is very clear that there will be political effects from that. So I think the other thing that you're seeing, and I think this is why the fragmentation is happening, the other thing you're seeing is politicians are beginning to digest that this is not a win-win. Now, obviously, we've got to get there. Don't get me wrong. We've got to get there. But there are political disruptions that are beginning to be felt by policymakers. So, while we're all really keen, and everybody on this call, I'm sure, is leaning in to the goal, and corporates need to be supported to make the transition, I think actually that sort of tragedy of the horizon is kind of working in reverse, in the sense that we're building up a lot of the risks, but we're going to start to feel some of the consequences politically of making those changes. So those two big things for me are the sort of overriding context of why I think COP is unlikely to be some big leap forward.
That's really interesting, especially what you said towards the end there about the realization that there is political risk in this, because it seems to me that a lot of Martin's optimism, which I share, since the alternative is despair, is based on a wholesale reinvention of government or of its role in the process. But anyway, enough from me. Will, I promised I'd come back to you, and Rob, I see your hands up, and then we'll come back to some people in the chat. Will.
Thanks, Giles. I just wanted to comment on a couple of things Martin was saying. I'm sort of in a sort of very boring way. I'm going to agree with him, but try and put things in context. So this 3 trillion extra investment, it sounds like a big number per year, and I think it is a big number, but it's in the context of a global economy that's 70 trillion today, growing to 100 trillion. So 3% of GDP that we might need to invest over the next 20 years, more than we would have done if climate change didn't exist. So it's a big number, but it's achievable, and all it needs is the will. I'm not saying this is easy, but a 3% of GDP investment over 20 years we can do. I agree, Martin says we've got the technology, we do have the technology, we know how to do this. So it's just trying to work out some of these above ground factors to allow or create the incentives that allocates capital in an efficient way to allow the private sector, with support from the government, to go after this. So I do think it's not easy, but it is possible. So I think it's not all despair. I think the points that David just made, completely agree again, really, really good points. The tragedy of the horizon one is important. Private companies need policy certainty. We need to know that if we invest billions in this decade, we can reap the rewards next decade. And so trying to overcome that, I think I started off as a macroeconomist. 30 years ago now, I think it was seen that governments weren't good stewards of inflation. They would manipulate prices depending on the political cycle, so it was removed from their hands, and that overcame the tragedy of the horizon from a monetary policy point of view. I mean, can we think of sort of innovation in public policy that allows the world to overcome the tragedy from an energy investment or a financial incentives point of view? A question I don't have a fully thought out answer, but it's just something that came to mind.
Can I ask just one point of detail about the 3 trillion per year? Is the idea that this is extra investment exclusively in renewables, or in a new energy infrastructure that still includes some sort of fossil fuel baseload?
My understanding, Martin, you correct me if I'm wrong, this is everything. So I think a lot of this is grid infrastructure. One of the big things we need to do is strengthen the grid, transmission and distribution. So that's a huge investment. Obviously, wind and solar renewables, which have high upfront costs, which is what Rob was saying at the start, big capex, sort of zero opex essentially. So that would be part of it. But it also involves things like investing in pipelines for carbon capture, investments in hydrogen, investments on the demand side as well. So my understanding is it's everything. But Martin, correct me if I'm wrong.
Thank you. Let's come back to Robert Gross, and then if possible, I'd love to hear a little bit from Glyn Skerrett about why you're an ex-optimist, but Robert first.
Thanks, Giles. A comment first on grounds for optimism. So you mentioned the Tony Blair Institute. 20 years ago, I was working in the Cabinet Office, in the think tank that Tony Blair, when he was being a Prime Minister and before he got unpopular, put in place to do an energy review that kicked off the first UK target for CO2 emissions. It was then a 60% target. One of the things that I was working on was technology learning curves and what we might say about innovation. in the context of that. And at that time, wind and solar were an insignificant fraction of the UK. So I know there's still a very small fraction of global final energy demand, completely right. But they were then an insignificant fraction of electricity supply. Renewables are now 50%. And when you count nuclear in, low carbon is a much higher percent. And we've seen the same success in a number of other countries. And they're also bloody expensive at that time. And I know we've seen in the chat that levelized cost of energy and grid parity doesn't mean everything. And I understand all of that. It's complex. You could have another whole more than an hour on it. But the levelized costs have come down immensely. The innovation that we've seen is enormous. And if you also think about the EV market, you don't even have to go back 20 years, go back 10 years, you could buy an electric car called a G-Whiz. It was a kind of milk float technology thing with a top speed of about 30 miles an hour and a range of about 10 miles. And you can now buy a Tesla Model S, and I know they're expensive. Or you can buy a range of offerings from other car vehicle manufacturers. And I know they're still relatively expensive, but the innovation that we've seen in terms of range and performance is incredible. None of those things happened by themselves. All of those things happened because of, largely because of the kind of pressure of policy that then enabled opportunities for niche markets and for markets to begin to develop that allowed those technologies to improve. So we now have an opportunity that we didn't previously have. And just very quickly on the kind of risk-reward ratio, I think there's two things that governments, maybe three, there's two key things that governments in regulation and intervention needs to do. The first is for this kind of infrastructure assets, like grid infrastructure, and certainly I think wind and solar and so on, you need to de-risk the investment proposition so you get cheap money in, so that you can tap into institutional investors and pension funds and so on. But for other things where we're currently not, where we're failing, like we're failing to do carbon capture and storage, we're not doing hydrogen at scale, then you create an opportunity for the risk takers to reap the rewards so that you can speed this stuff up. And then I think, that you're beginning to get to the nuts and bolts of something that is much less abstract than, the kind of abstract concepts of mobilizing global finance and those kinds of things.
Just to be clear that I understand you, when we're failing on CCS and hydrogen, you're saying that we inadvertently create an opportunity for the risk takers? Or,
I think that we need, the thing about hydrogen is that it unlocks the potential to decarbonize bits of the energy system that you can't decarbonize using electricity. Yeah. Okay. And we're not delivering we use hydrogen for other purposes, but we're not delivering hydrogen as an energy vector at scale. And I know there's a big debate about CCS, and ultimately it doesn't get you to net zero and all of those things, and what its role should be. Almost all of the scenarios of deep decarbonisation have a role for CCS, carbon capture and storage. Yeah. And at the moment, we're not at that, the stage that the world should be at is large scale demonstration of a significant number of CCS plants. And we've been saying that we're going to do that for at least 15 years and not doing it.
Right, understood. I'd love to just in a second come back to Jade, because Robert was talking about the innovators, and I'd love to know whether in your experience, Jade, innovators are getting the hearing that they deserve from this government, whether they are identified as such and get the sort of preferential treatment that arguably they deserve. But first, I did say I wanted to hear from Glyn about why you're an ex-optimist. And Martin, I see your hand up as well. Glyn, can we come to you? Glyn, hi.
Hi, thanks, Giles. It's probably more a symptom of my age than anything else. And I wouldn't wish to give the impression of a pessimist, but I guess I'm trying to be a pragmatist. And after spending 25 years teaching, lecturing about sustainability and environmental management, progressively, I just get more concerned that despite the whole issue of net zero and an interest in saving the planet having risen meteorically up the agenda in the last 5 years, and despite a lot of significant movement by particularly large corporations in many different industrial sectors, I still fear that politicians, me being cynical, politicians are politicians, and given the political cycle, and given what I've increasingly grown to feel is the importance of firmer regulation to give everybody some certainty and clarity and a roadmap by which we're going to achieve the fine words that we all talk about. I just don't see that crystallizing in the timescale that's necessary, and I really do take no pleasure whatsoever in feeling that way or saying it or sharing it.
I mean, this is a weird sort of optimism to posit, but do you think that a bit more of the kind of extreme weather events reliably attributed to climate change might actually do the trick before we tip into past a point of no return?
I think the issue for me is that it's a global problem, a global challenge, and requires a global solution. And at the moment, I see things moving away from any coalescing to attempt to achieve that, despite the kind of issues that you've just raised, which I think will force the public. Hopefully, none of this will come to pass, although maybe it won't matter to me, and people will encourage political and business decision makers to both put in place the regulation and enact the policies and innovate to deliver, I won't say what's necessary. I mean, it's more than that. If they don't deliver it, it's curtains.
Right. Okay. Thank you. There's that word, innovate again. Jade, if you're an innovator, do you get a decent hearing from this government?
The short answer is no. At least not from my perspective, because and I'll give two examples. One is a CCS technology company called Sea Capture, based in the north, and they've done a prototype with Drax, and that's basically as far as they've got. There's been no kind of, as Rob was saying, there's been no kind of large scale upscaling of it, and the money that the government has given for those sorts of companies to upscale has been minuscule in terms of what we need, in terms of what the kind of how fast it needs to grow and when it needs to grow. The other is a company called HyNet, based in the northwest, which is a kind of a hydrogen network. Again, there's been very little government funding or even government regulation on hydrogen, despite the recent strategy launched by the government. And so they are, they're competing for, again, a very minuscule amount of funding that's been given. It's by the term, industrial clusters. They are vying to be part of those industrial clusters, along with loads of other technology companies. So there's options there, but it's not enough for kind of how fast and how quickly we need to get there.
Right. So minuscule compared with what's required. Do you happen to know, is it also minuscule compared with equivalent sums on offer to mitigate risk in other countries? I mean, one thinks, that world-class phrase, which is bandied about by this government, everyone's trying to be world-class, and my sense is that a lot more money is put behind those efforts elsewhere.
I don't know kind of the exact figures in the EU Fit for 55. It depends in which sector you're kind of looking at, I think potentially another panelist might be able to give a specific figure if you're looking for one.
Okay, well, let's see. Well, we can put him on the spot. Martin, you had your hand up. What did you want to say?
Okay, there you go. Well, no, very briefly, I wanted to pick up on Rob's point, which I on the whole agree with. But he made a point about electric vehicles, and there is an interesting data point which I thought was interesting bringing into the discussion. In the IEA's net zero plan, global oil consumption falls by about a quarter by 2030. So over the next decade, we lose 25%. And a big driver behind that is uptick in electric vehicles, which by 2030 in the IEA's modeling reaches 60%. So 60% of new cars sold will need to become an electric vehicle worldwide. And that would be consistent with this scenario in which oil demand falls by a quarter. There is one country globally who has already delivered that in terms of electric vehicle sales, which is Norway. Norway's very advanced in all of this with huge government stimulus in place. As of last month, 72% of every car sold in Norway, 72% of all cars sold in Norway was an electric vehicle already. And a decade ago, that was also zero. So over the last decade, Norway has realized what over the next decade, the world needs to realize. The tricky issue is, though, that in Norway, this has had zero impact on oil demand, as in Norway's oil demand has remained flat. So now there are many reasons for that. If you dive into the reasons for that, you very quickly come to the conclusion, well, they could well apply to the world at large, which then underscores this idea that from a technology point of view, we have a lot to be optimistic about where we can be sort of later this century. But just actually getting the sort of transition going, even if we are successful in some of these things like EV sales, the impact on demand for traditional fossil fuels may still be somewhat surprising. And I thought that Norway data point was a fascinating data point. So I wanted to mention.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, both the scale of EV uptake, but also the fact that oil consumption remains flat. We are running out of time. I told you it would fly by. I want to give each of our four panelists a chance very briefly, and it will have to be brief, just to say, well, however you want to wrap up. But I'd like to know what keeps you awake at night, as in your principal worry, and what gives you hope. Who shall we start with? Robert.
So I think that what keeps me awake at night is, I think it's been touched upon, is the kind of really disheartening sort of state of international cooperation and kind of fragmentation of what we thought was a kind of growing consensus around so many things. And I've already said, I think that what gives me grounds for optimism is that we do have the tools at our disposal because we've seen so much technological innovation. So we can go if we want to, and if we can get that coordination effort, which is going to be the big challenge, we could go after this really, really aggressively and ambitiously and try and really solve the climate problem.
Okay, thanks. Jade, same question to you. What keeps you awake at night, and what gives you hope?
I think the government keeps me awake at night. I mean, take one look at the recent transport decarbonisation plan or any other plan they've said that they passed, and it doesn't contain a plan at all. It's just a kind of mismatch of policies all brought together in hopes that if the government throws shit, something will stick. Excuse the phrase. So that keeps me up at night. The hope is that there are many individuals on the call and people sat in this room who are educated, passionate, and in their day-to-day jobs can push forward their companies to make changes. And that gives me real hope that we can continue educating people and helping companies make their net zero strategies and get what they want from government and implement some real changes.
Thank you. Martin and then Will.
Yeah, very briefly, and this might sound somewhat counterintuitive, but I think there are also some grounds of concern. There are some grounds to be concerned about the investment in traditional fossil fuel. And again, this may sound very counterintuitive, but let me give you one number. In the IEA's estimate of the amount of investment that is still needed in oil and gas, for example, over the next decade, even with oil demand falling by 25% over that period, we would still need to invest about $350 billion or so every year for the next decade to keep existing oil and gas fields kind of going for as long as we still need them. 350 billion, that is consistent with Paris. Last year, the oil industry did indeed invest 350 billion. Investment in oil and gas field has fallen tremendously to a level that now would be consistent even with a Paris scenario. And this year we're coming out of the post-COVID recovery and investment levels are not rebounding because the threat of the energy transition is such a red flag for traditional fossil fuel industries that it has a detrimental impact on investment. And that creates the prospect that we could get a peak in the supply of those fuels before we are able to get a peak in demand. And in that sense, that could create a period of market tightness. You're already seeing it today. Global coal demand peaked in 2013. At the moment, we have nearly all-time high coal prices. We have exceptionally high natural gas prices at the moment for many similar reasons. So we still need to keep the traditional fossil fuel industry also healthy whilst the transition lasts, and that is one area.
Okay, thanks. Will, your chief worry and your source of hope?
Yeah, I mean, chief worry, I think failure to scale fast enough. We need to move quickly on all fronts, and I think we need to get the public sector and the private sector working together, and that's really important. And my concern is we're going to leave it too late. Reasons for confidence is that I think people are up for it. As Jade said, it feels like that there has been movement over the past year or so. We've seen commitments from governments. The China commitment, the 2060 net zero commitment, is very significant. There's been lots of commitments from different companies, some in energy intensive sectors like BP wanting to green and have made net zero announcements, but across the board. So I think that there is a willingness and a commitment to do this. And so that gives me a sense of optimism.
Thank you all very much. I've got lots of pages of notes that I've got to go through with my highlighter, but and a lot of really interesting counterintuitive points, not least this last one about static oil demand in Norway. What do we have to do if at 72% EV uptake that is the case? But really struck by Rob's faith, most people's faith in technology and in the will being out there if it can only be tapped. But I'm still struck from what everyone has said by the scale of commitment still needed by government to see the big picture. And I think Glyn's point about the sort of short-term and local response to a global and long-term problem is well made. And David's point also about the regulatory convergence that we needed to happen, not happening yet. So an immense amount still to be done leading up to COP, at COP, and beyond. This is just the start of a conversation about greening in general and the economics of it. But I've learned a lot, and I'm very, very grateful to Will, Martin, Jade, and Rob, and everyone else who's participated. We've gone just a couple of minutes over, but thank you once again, and do stay tuned for our future net zero sense makers and everything that we're putting out on that subject on the Tortoise website. Thanks again for joining us.